Hi, everyone. Phil Travis here, your instructor here at Eastern Oregon University, Civil War and Reconstruction. This week's lesson really deals with the summer of 1863, um, the role of emancipation, and then, of course, the campaigns at Vicksburg and Gettysburg, and also Chancellorsville. These campaigns really changed the war, and it turned the war in favor of the Union. It is perhaps fitting that Gettysburg and Vicksburg were finalized on basically July 4th weekend. Gettysburg ending on the 3rd of July, and of course Vicksburg on the 4th of July, as these wars were in many ways, in the long term, they really sealed the victory for the Union. They turned the tide of the war, and this is not to say that the outcome was necessarily determined, but it turned the tide of the war. And at this point, it seemed that the Union had finally won the victories that would be capable of preserving the Union.
So by the end of 1862, you really see the Northern strategy become a strategy of total war, a war of attrition. It becomes a strategy to blockade and starve the South out. It became a strategy that targeted the Southern home front as much as it did the Southern Army, target the Southern economy. It becomes a total war of attrition. Emancipation is used first. It's first called in 1862. It is formally dictated on January 1st, 1863, with the Emancipation Proclamation. Emancipation was used as a strategy. It was strategic to free the slaves in the seceded states. Lincoln did not enforce the proclamation in border states. It was designed as a strategic move against seceded states to basically create unrest within the states and undermine what's left of the plantation system. And of course, 1 in 7 slaves fled to Union lines. It wasn't a terribly popular decision in the North, and had the war been begun as a war to free the slaves, likely it would have been not supported in the North. But it does give Lincoln and the North an overall stronger moral position, internationally speaking. And this was another ultimate factor in encouraging international powers like the British to not support the South in favor of the Union. Of course, the British were sort of divided on that issue. Many of the aristocratic elements in Great Britain sort of related to the planter aristocracy in the South. The strategy of the North now becomes, by 1863, a total war strategy to control the Mississippi and through that cut the South in two and enhance a total blockade, to ravage Georgia and the Carolinas, cut them up from the inside. You'll see this with Sherman's March to the Sea, to capture the capital of Richmond, which occurs at the end, towards the end of the war, to use attrition to ultimately wear down the enemy's strengths. So by 1862, the Civil War has absolutely become a total war of attrition.
Ulysses S. Grant, who is pictured here, this picture is actually from Cold Harbor in 1863. Ulysses S. Grant was born in a small house on the Ohio River, a place called Point Pleasant. I've been there. It's quite a small, modest place. His father was a tanner. He served in the Mexican-American War and proved himself in the Civil War, of course, to be a brilliant strategist and brilliant commander. Um, Ulysses S. Grant was also, in some respects, a very interesting person. For a military man, he was actually nauseated by the sight of blood, which one might find rather interesting. Um, he was rather private about himself when he was bathing. He liked cigars and he liked to drink, and he had a reputation, some felt, for being um, maybe too much of a drinker. Some had commented that Grant seemed a little bit disheveled, wrinkled, and smelled of cigar smoke and alcohol. But nonetheless, these kind of characteristics, which may have factored into why he had not had a more significant post earlier in the war, nonetheless, really do not take away from his genius and his brilliance as a military commander. In many respects, Ulysses S. Grant possessed the same qualities that Robert E. Lee did, and that is the qualities of outthinking your opponent and acting more aggressively than your opponent when the time is right. Grant really proved this, particularly in the Vicksburg campaign, and of course Lee had proven that time and time again. So it was really the Vicksburg campaign where Grant truly emerges as a brilliant strategist. He was in many ways, like Lee, very aggressive. He took initiative when he thought the enemy would be unable to either take initiative or stop him. At Vicksburg, Grant ignored the advice of his high command, and who suggested he should retreat back to Memphis and set up a new attack. But Grant understood something, and that is that at this time in the war, it was a very desperate time for the Union. Both Grant at Vicksburg and George Meade, when he's appointed and oversees the battle at Gettysburg, really understood that they were very much fighting for the survival of the Union. The war was very much on a tipping point. There was a political movement in the North, the Copperheads, so-called, the Democrat Copperheads, and there were other moderates in the North that were beginning to push for a potential peaceful solution. There were also overtures that would recognize the South. There were also Southern overtures towards France and Great Britain at this time. And so things were not going good for the Union. Grant had failed earlier to take Vicksburg earlier that year, and this had caused a bit of a malaise in the North. And what had caused an even greater malaise in the North was in May of 1863, the crushing defeat that the Union, led by Fighting Joe Hooker at that time, suffered at the Battle of Chancellorsville and also Fredericksburg ultimately. Chancellorsville in May of 1863 proved to be Lee's greatest victory. It was Robert E. Lee's greatest victory in Virginia. He outmaneuvered and he outthought his opponent, Fighting Joe Hooker, who seemed to be convinced that the Confederate forces, who were outnumbered relatively significantly, would have retreated. But Lee at Chancellorsville did some of his most bold things that he could have done, sending Jackson on a flanking maneuver in which Jackson was forced to expose his entire flank. But Hooker failed to really recognize what was happening, as did General Howard, one of his subordinates. And so at Chancellorsville, the forces of Lee and Jackson won a crushing victory against the forces of Fighting Joe Hooker. And the news of this loss really sent shockwaves through the North, through the Union, as increasingly people in the Union started to feel that maybe in Virginia they couldn't beat Lee. But of course, the battle that's often overlooked, and of course at Chancellorsville, by the way, Jackson was, of course, shot by his own troops in the moonlight raid. It was an afternoon dusk attack, and Jackson was misidentified and shot by his own troops in the arm, and of course suffered an amputation and got an infection, pneumonia, and died 8 days later. And of course, it wouldn't be clear immediately how much that would affect Lee's forces, but of course it was a very significant effect on the Confederate capabilities after Chancellorsville. But at Vicksburg develops from April to July of 1863. At Vicksburg, Grant really kind of emerges as one of a great leader of the conflict. He was aggressive, and at Vicksburg he uses a very bold plan, not unlike some of Lee's aggressive actions. He refuses to go on the defensive, acknowledging that if you continue to go on the defensive like this, that it's going to increasingly hurt the Union's position when it comes to trying to reunite the country. Grant knew that the Union needed a victory, and so Grant created a bold plan in which he would send a fleet of ironclads and supply ships down the Mississippi River south past Vicksburg. I'll show you a map in just a minute, on the west side of the river. And they would do this at night. And the idea was you would set up the flotilla downriver, and then you would move your troops and cross the river below Vicksburg, below the southern flank, if you will. Then the idea, and this was really, really a gamble by Grant, he would use his troops, which were largely Midwestern farm boys. The guys fighting in the West would have been, Midwesterners, and they would have had certainly a great deal of understanding when it came to living off of the land. And they were exceptional fighters, and actually most of the original Army regulars were, of course, from the Midwest, and they were stationed in the Western Theater as well. Maybe the biggest gamble here after the flotilla operation down the river was that Grant would basically break free of his supply lines. He would enter Mississippi. He would fight within Mississippi. They would live off the land. They would forage the countryside. They would plunder the plantations. They would attack Jackson, and they would attack the Confederate lines, really behind the lines of Pemberton in the Vicksburg area. And Pemberton was convinced to hold Vicksburg. That was what he was going to do, was hold Vicksburg. This is, of course, was a huge gamble, but Jackson, Grant really assumed that his earlier failure was based largely on relying on his supply lines and having his supply line cut. And so in this case, he would use the people in his army who had a lot of experience living off the land to break free of the supply lines, cross the river, enter Mississippi, cut up Mississippi from the inside, and cut the enemy's supply lines and do the opposite to them. And, of course, this is what ultimately happens. General Sherman, of course, Sherman's Corps very early on began to get its reputation for being the corps to give the duties of destroying supply lines and these types of things. Sherman's forces operated behind the enemy's lines, and they tore up railroad tracks, and they burned supply depots. In fact, even burned Jackson, Mississippi. And they earned a reputation for this, of course, and they'll become known later for, of course, Sherman's March to the Sea. The Union forces foraged off the land and the people, much to the chagrin of plantation farmers who had their animals and their food and these types of things taken from them. But, of course, this is now really a total war, and the forces of Grant are fighting for the Union. This is the absolute really last-ditch chance in Vicksburg and later at Gettysburg to win some major victories and secure and preserve the chance of preservation of the Union. Emancipation is put into action in Mississippi as freedmen, slaves are organized in kind of ragtag units, and they use many old, even smoothbore weapons. But the freedmen fight exceptionally, relatively speaking. And, of course, the usage of emancipated freedmen in the conflict, really in the battles, really angered many of the Confederacies, who in many cases were reported to murder captured freedmen slaves. But nonetheless, the freedmen fought well, and it really was a source of anger for many Confederate soldiers who fought them. After the kind of interior fighting behind the lines, Grant and Sherman's forces cut up rail lines. They win battles in Jackson, Mississippi, and ultimately push Pemberton and his Confederate forces in a series of battles, 5 of them, if I'm not mistaken, push them back into Vicksburg. And Grant then sieges Vicksburg for a course of about 2 months, or maybe a little bit less. Sieges Vicksburg. Vicksburg becomes a traditional kind of what you would expect in this kind of a conflict, similar to what will happen in Petersburg. Confederate soldiers are, some of them suffering scurvy. They have issues with basic necessities. They are as weary of war as you could be. And some of them even suggested that Pemberton should surrender if victory was not secure. And, of course, Pemberton does ultimately surrender on July 4th, 1863. There were disagreements between Pemberton and General Johnston, the other Confederate general. There were disagreements about goals here. Johnston felt that Pemberton should break out of Vicksburg and try to, relocate and give up Vicksburg. Pemberton was convinced he had to hold Vicksburg and wanted Johnston to resupply. And Johnston was late on that, and that led in part to the surrender of Pemberton. Of course, the plan also at Vicksburg to hold Vicksburg without resupply was also encouraged by Lee and Davis, Jefferson Davis, discussing strategy. And Lee, of course, had surmised that he could launch an invasion into Pennsylvania, an offensive action into Pennsylvania, and win a major victory that could encourage a treaty. And he felt that Vicksburg could hold out long enough for this to occur, and that would effectively solve the real failure of the Confederacy to be able to resupply Pemberton in Vicksburg. The Confederacy has a real shortness of supplies and troops right now. And in some respects, at this point, it was either resupply Lee or resupply Pemberton. It really meant either resupplying Pemberton at the cost of Lee or allowing Pemberton to try to hold out so that Lee could use his force, the Army of Northern Virginia, to force a treaty with an offensive campaign into Gettysburg, ultimately where Gettysburg is. And that, of course, is what Davis and Lee ultimately accept on. So Pemberton, his reinforcements would have come from forces that were fighting with Lee in places like Virginia, and it would have weakened Lee and would not have made his operations into Pennsylvania really possible. And so this is what's going on at this time. When Pemberton surrenders the day after Gettysburg is when Vicksburg falls. And, of course, this is probably he was probably trying to hold out long enough to see a Confederate victory. And, of course, it's by chance that a day later, after Gettysburg, is a defeat for the Confederacy, that Vicksburg also falls. And together, Vicksburg and Gettysburg together were really crushing defeats for the Confederacy. Really turns the tide in the war. This is a look at the ironclads going down the Mississippi, being sieged from Confederate forces by Vicksburg, Mississippi. These ironclads were protecting supply ships, and of course they were going by veil of the night, and actually they were floating down the river by current, but they were discovered, and of course the Confederate forces lit fires along the banks to illuminate them, and they opened up shelling and shelled these ships, but very few were severely damaged. It was a highly successful gamble by Grant. This is an image of the Union battle, victory against the Confederates at Jackson, Mississippi. This is just a depiction of that battle. This is a battle plan map, and you can see, if you look here, you can see where Grant, down below Vicksburg, where he crosses the Mississippi, and then the Union forces go up and attack Johnson, and they attack Jackson, Mississippi, and they cut supply lines and ultimately turn around and push Pemberton back into Vicksburg, where they ultimately siege Vicksburg. So Gettysburg coupled with Vicksburg is really the turning point in the war. After Lee's crushing success at Chancellorsville, and of course also Fredericksburg, Lee was emboldened to go into Pennsylvania, launch an offensive that could win a major victory on Union grounds, which he believed could encourage political support for a peace treaty, groups like the Copperheads, and could also encourage international recognition by the French and also the British. Chancellorsville was a great success. However, Chancellorsville also resulted in Lee losing perhaps his most valuable commander, Stonewall Jackson, who, of course, in the twilight battle that was Chancellorsville, Stonewall Jackson was ultimately accidentally shot in the arm by his own troops, and of course suffered infection and died 8 days later. Lee, of course, had convinced Davis that Davis should support this offensive plan rather than reposition troops from the east over to Vicksburg. Lee hoped to win a major battle, and of course, Lee might be criticized in some cases for the decisions that he made at Gettysburg, but one has to remember that Lee was getting quite used to expecting Union commanders to act in a manner that was less aggressive than himself. Lee's victories, Lee was on a winning spree. He had won great victories at Chancellorsville over fighting Joe Hooker. And of course, Lee was very much expectant that he wouldn't meet great resistance from a Union army that's now being commanded by General George Meade, who is pictured here next to Lee. Meade had only been in command of his army for 8 days. And of course, Meade was under tremendous pressure. Just as Grant understood in his Vicksburg campaign the importance of a major victory, the importance of not backing down any further, the North needed a victory. It needed a morale boost. In the same respect, Meade knew that he really, at the Battle of Gettysburg, had the Union hanging on a string, that he had to prevent a defeat in order to continue this effort to preserve the Union. So Meade's really fighting here to not lose. He's not fighting for an all-out victory. Lee very much is fighting for an all-out victory, and he's fighting for an all-out victory against an army that he's continually really outmaneuvered and out-strategized. Gettysburg really is also Lee's last chance for a big victory. The Confederacy is slowly beginning to feel the pressure of the blockade, and if international support doesn't come in a very thorough way, it's unlikely that Lee's going to have another shot at this. So he really has to win this battle. In the course of the battle, of course, the Union forces performed quite well. Union cavalry staved off Jeb Stuart's cavalry. The Union artillery commander tricked Lee. And the way he tricked Lee is because the Union artillery, and this is during Pickett's charge most significantly, Union artillery was down behind a hill. And when Pickett's charge was about to be sent by Lee, the artillery commander, during the artillery barrage, had moved his artillery pieces, causing the Confederate artillery to overshoot them. So the Confederate artillery was missing them. Well, during the artillery barrage, the Union artillery stopped returning fire, giving Lee the impression, of course, that the guns had been silenced. Of course, they had not. And this was a huge mistake. Lee had been, in a way, outcalculated here. Lee, of course, will launch the infamous Pickett's Charge. Pickett's Charge, this is on the third day. The third day is the climactic day. And General Longstreet's really, really protested this. Longstreet was commanding the group that Pickett was a part of, and Pickett's unit was about 14,000 men. And Longstreet's insisted that Lee was making a huge mistake. And he pleaded with Lee. He said, don't do this, because there's no way in Pickett's mind that an army of 14,000 could march across a 3/4 mile field, over the road, over the fence, and against the enemy forces and be successful. This was a frontal assault. Lee, of course, was convinced it could succeed. He was convinced that it had succeeded in the past, and he had little reason, given his past successes in 1862 and 1863, little reason to believe that it wouldn't succeed. Of course, Pickett's Charge fails, and a big reason that it failed, the big reason for the failure was because, of course, the artillery of the Union, the Union artillery commander, moving his artillery and tricking Lee. When the Confederate forces move on Cemetery Ridge and they approach the defensive position of Union General Hancock under Meade, of course, the artillery opens up with grape shot on the canister shot and grape shot on the Confederate forces, and the Confederate forces are decimated. There was a brief breakthrough by a small unit that's repulsed in a matter of minutes, and Pickett's charge in this 3-day battle is really over in about 30 minutes. Of the 14,000 troops who marched off, and it was an epic sight that people told stories of till the day they died. It was an epic sight of a 14,000-man army moving across a three-quarter mile area in very great fashion. It was, as McPherson says, it was a microcosm of the Confederate war effort, an aggressive and heroic effort that ultimately ended in a failure. Pickett's men, of the 14,000, only 7,000 returned, and Lee was crushed by this. Lee understood the mistake he had made. Lee understood how devastating it was, and Lee rallied his troops in case there would be a counterattack. Of course, Meade's counterattack never came. Meade was more than satisfied with not being beaten. He was more than satisfied with more or less of a draw. He would allow Lee to retreat to Virginia. He would not counterattack. Some have criticized Meade for this, but of course the battle goes down as a great success for the Union. It was all the Union needed, and Meade knew that was all the Union needed, was to not be defeated by Robert E. Lee. Of course, Robert E. Lee will return into Virginia, and the next day, of course, Vicksburg falls to Grant, and together these two battles really mark the turning point. It was this point after which the blockade became really thorough, in which the Union really opened up the inside of the South and waged a war, a total war of attrition that the South really could not win. It was at Gettysburg that any last chance of international recognition was gone at Gettysburg. Alexander Stevens' peace initiative is going to be refused. Any chance of recognition is really lost after Gettysburg. There are still political problems in the North in some cases. There are still efforts to create a peace treaty after this, but in all reality, it was gone after Gettysburg. This is a look at the third day of the battle map of the third day at Gettysburg. Of course, some of the hardest fighting throughout Gettysburg was fought down there towards the bottom near the Devil's Den and Little Round Top. Of course, you can see Pickett's charge up against the main force of Hancock's unit as part of Meade's Union forces. Union losses after this battle were 23,000. Confederates were more, 27,000. And of course, Lincoln will refuse Vice President Stevenson's peace request, and very much Lincoln undoubtedly recognized the importance of these battles, these successes at Vicksburg and at Gettysburg.